My name is Kay Dickerson. This session is called Trial Registration. Our first speaker is Dr. An-Wen Chan, and he's going to talk about association of trial registration with reporting of clinical trials.
Great. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So there are several scientific and ethical reasons supporting the need for trial registration. In this talk, I'm going to be focusing on these three key goals. So firstly, registration helps to track the existence of all initiated trials. Secondly, it can help to identify and deter selective reporting of outcomes. And thirdly, registration aims to promote transparency. So what is the evidence that trial registration is actually achieving these goals? Well, empirical data are currently limited to studies that have examined cohorts of registered trials or cohorts of published trials. But what would give us the most complete picture is if we could examine the universe of all initiated trials in terms of assessing adherence to registration and potential impact on outcome reporting. So our study examined three main objectives. The first was to assess the true registration rate based on a cohort of initiated trials, to evaluate whether there were discrepancies in the primary outcomes defined in the protocol compared with the registry, as well as the protocol compared with a publication. And finally, to evaluate whether registration was associated with better reporting in subsequent publications. So our study cohort consisted of all clinical trial protocols approved by an ethics committee in the region of Helsinki and Uusimaa in southern Finland, the most populous region. And we looked at protocols approved in 2007 and 2002 to give them sufficient time to be published. We excluded studies that were extensions of previously approved trials, as well as trials that focused primarily on pharmacokinetic or economic outcomes, or studies that focused on diagnostic accuracy properties. For each protocol that was approved, we identified corresponding registry records as well as published journal articles. So to identify registry records, we searched the WHO's International Clinical Trials Registry Platform search portal, and we also used Google. We defined a prospective registry record as having been registered within 30 days of the trial start date. We also searched for journal publications, and our last search was conducted in February of 2017. We searched the usual electronic databases, so PubMed, Embase, the Cochrane Central database, Google, as well as three Finnish databases, Medic, Arto, and Tuhat. From these three information sources, we extracted in duplicate all of the trial outcomes, and from the protocol, we extracted the trial characteristics. So our final cohort consisted of 248 trials across the 2 approval years. You can see that the vast majority were of randomized design. The majority evaluated drug interventions, involved multiple study sites. Just over 40% were industry sponsored, and 80% of the protocols defined at least one primary outcome. The median planned sample size was 200, which is above average for clinical trials. So what do we find in terms of registration and publication rates? Well, you can see in red our trials approved in 2002 and in blue trials approved in 2007. So no trials approved in 2002 were registered, compared with 61% of trials approved in 2007. In terms of publication, the publication rates were around the usual 50% that's been shown in multiple studies over the past 2 decades. So I'm going to focus the rest of the results on the trials approved in 2007. There were 113 of these, and I'm restricting the rest of this talk on this sample because no trials in 2002 were registered. So as you saw in the previous slide, 61% of these trials were registered, 57% were published. So if we break this down, there were 24% of protocols which were neither registered nor published. 42% were both registered and published. 19% were only registered but unpublished, and 15% were published but unregistered. We evaluated the trial characteristics that were associated with being registered, and you can see that having evaluated a drug intervention was significantly associated with being registered with a 31-fold higher odds compared to non-drug interventions. And having a larger sample size above the median of 200 was also associated with being registered. Our next objective was to evaluate consistency in the primary outcomes between the registry and the protocol. And we found that 19% of registered trials had changes to the protocol-defined primary outcomes, meaning that they either omitted a protocol-defined primary outcome or downgraded it to non-primary in the registry record. We found that 5% introduced new primary outcomes in the registry that had not been defined as primary in the protocol. And so overall, over a fifth of registered trials had inconsistent primary outcomes between the registry record and the original protocol. We next compared the primary outcomes defined in the published journal articles versus the protocol. And here we found 9% of published trials made changes to the protocol-defined primary outcomes. 13% introduced new primary outcomes in the published article that were not defined in the protocol. And overall, 16% had major discrepancies in the primary outcomes between publication and protocol. So our final objective was to evaluate whether registration was associated with improved reporting. And we found that registered trials had a 4.5-fold higher odds of being published compared with unregistered trials, and that they were also almost six-fold higher odds of being published without any discrepancies in the primary outcomes between the protocol and the published article. And these estimates were derived from multivariable logistic regression adjusting for the study characteristics I presented earlier. So what does this all mean? Well, we found that registration was associated with significantly better reporting in terms of increased chance of being published without discrepant primary outcomes. However, we also found that fewer than 2/3 of trials were registered at all, and that in almost a quarter of cases, the registered primary outcomes did not match those in the original trial protocol. So what can we do about it? It's clear that we need better adherence mechanisms for registration of all drug and non-drug trials, and this would involve all stakeholders implementing and enforcing policies requiring registration for studies within their sphere of influence, and particularly research ethics committees or institutional review boards are the only real gatekeeper that see every single clinical trial, or should see every single clinical trial that is initiated. So they can play a key role in ensuring registration. It's also important to ensure public access to the full study protocols, as we have found that the registry records do not often reflect the primary outcomes in the protocol. And so it's important that these stakeholders also implement policies calling for public access to these documents, and further, that these documents actually can contain complete information. And this could be improved, as we found that 20% of protocols did not define a primary outcome. This can be improved by adherence to reporting standards for protocols, such as this International Spirit Guidance, which has been widely adopted. And we are now developing a web tool that will help authors to develop protocols based on Spirit, and with the push of a button, upload and register information directly and accurately to ClinicalTrials.gov so that there are fewer discrepancies. So just to announce that this paper was published in JAMA Online today, and to acknowledge my co-authors on the study, as well as the funders, the Academy of Finland and Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, An-Wen. And when you come to the microphone, could you please announce your name and your affiliation? Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Trish Groves, BMJ. Thanks, An-Wen. That's great. It's always interesting to see a study that starts with ethics committees. And I wondered if anybody in the room is aware of any ethics committees that enforce trial registration. I'm aware of one, which is the National Health Research Authority in the UK, who will not approve a clinical trial done by anybody in the UK if that trial is not registered within 6 weeks of the first participant entering the trial. which is amazing and fantastic and good for them. But is anybody aware, I wonder, of any other ethics body that is enforcing trial registration as a condition of approval? And maybe, An-Wen, you're aware of some. Sorry, it's a very open question.
Sure. I mean, I guess we can see a show of hands to see if...
Yeah. Oh, good.
Very
so
few.
There are a few others.
So I will say, just from personal, so I'm the vice chair of our ethics committee, and we do require it, as do all University of Toronto ethics committees. I will say, though, that the situation in the UK is certainly not the norm, where you have a central body that can dictate that all ethics committees must have this requirement. When I worked at WHO to introduce the trial registration standards, we advocated with the United States Primer, the organization that organizes the conference for all IRBs and so on. And we put forth to them that, could you all help by requiring this? And it was clear that there were varying standards, varying policies across individual IRBs, at least within the United States. And so it is a challenging situation, but it would be great if ethics committees saw it within their remit, and I strongly believe it is, to introduce the requirement that all trials be registered as an ethical and a scientific requirement. And this would involve asking the question firstly, and then making approval conditional on subsequent registration.
Just a very brief follow-up. Whenever I talk to authors, I'm often surprised that many of them don't realize the ethical underpinnings of trial registration, and they've never read the Ottawa Statement. People think it's just red tape. They think it's bureaucracy. It's not.
Thank you.
Nancy Lowe from the University of Colorado, and also a journal editor. I'm struck by wondering if you had any ability to track those protocols in which the hypotheses were supported versus those that the hypotheses were not supported. And the problem of non-significant results not ever getting published is where I'm going.
So we did look at whether the changes to primary outcomes, kind of the direction of whether that favored the intervention or whether it did not favor the intervention or was neutral. And we actually found that that it was scattered across those three categories. So it wasn't that all primary outcome discrepancies were always in favor of the intervention, whether it was an efficacy or harms outcome. So
I was wondering about in relationship to whether or not it was published.
We did not look at that. Our focus was on consistency of reporting of outcomes. So
Got it.
we would have had to know the results of trials that never got published to see if they differ.
And you don't have the
And we don't have-
reports in the registry. You don't
Yeah,
have
we
a
don't
final
have-
report.
we
Got
do
it.
not. Yeah.
Got it.
Hi, Patrick Bossoet, Amsterdam. It's a great study. My question is about changes in the primary outcome measure between the first protocol submission and the trial registration. So do you find that unacceptable? Because it could be very well be that it makes sense actually to change the primary outcome measure, and it's a better understanding about the fallibility of the primary outcome measure, as long as you don't actually have access to the data yet.
Yeah. So can we, actually I can advance. It's almost like we planted this question. So if you have the protocol, then it's registered, and then there's amendments and so on, and then publication, right? So our comparison was between the most up-to-date protocol at the time of registration. So I assume if it was amended, that the protocol amendment should have been submitted to the ethics committee before registration. So we would have compared the contemporary information sources.
Could I ask a question? I think we still have a moment. And I don't know if you looked at it, but just even if you didn't look at it formally, did you see variation in the protocols that were submitted? Because it's always a question I hear is, what's a protocol?
Yeah, it's always a challenging issue. So when we, as you know, when we developed the SPIRIT guidelines, the first question was, well, what exactly is a protocol? And it was clear, depending on which stakeholder or which individual within a stakeholder group you asked, that the definitions varied. So some would say, it's our standard to always address authorship guidelines in the protocol or competing interests, and other people would say, oh no, we never include that, that's in our manual of procedures or something. So there's clearly no standard definition, but our goal with the Spirit guidance was to have a minimum set of items that would kind of form the protocol, and that was in part kind of what arose from that initiative. But it's clear that depending on who you ask, a protocol may differ. I think we should be able to agree, though, on what the key minimum information should be and what we should have access to up front to understand what is being planned for a trial.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much, An-Wen. We can go on to our next speaker.